Sanborn, Dakota Prairie, North Dakota, October 1908. The wind had teeth, and the sun was a pale, useless coin in the vast, empty sky. On the quarter section he'd proved up 2 years prior, Emilio Vercelli was building something that made no sense. It was a tower, a tall, slender skeleton of pine 2x4s, rising against the south-facing wall of his small sod and timber cabin. It dwarfed the house, 20 feet of raw lumber against a 12-foot roof line. His neighbors, hardy men of Norwegian and German stock, would slow their wagons on the section line road to watch. They saw him fitting panes of glass into the frame, dozens of them, shipped by rail at ruinous expense. "He's building a church window for a soddy," grumbled Lars Rasmussen to his son, his own hands chapped and raw from winterizing his barn. "A man that foolish with money will be a man begging for wood by January." Wesley Chittenden, the Sanborn County land assessor, made a special trip out. He stood with his hands on his hips, his ledger book tucked under an arm, a man whose entire world was measured in board feet, crop yields, and taxable value. He watched Emilio carefully apply a coat of black paint to the interior-facing sheathing inside the glass cage. "Mr. Vercelli," Chittenden called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of his office. "The Prairie has a way of punishing extravagance. That glass will be 1,000 daggers of ice come the first blizzard. It's a fool's folly." Emilio Vercelli, a man of few English words, merely paused, wiped a drip of black paint from his knuckle, and looked at the assessor. "The sun will be warm," he said, his voice quiet, before turning back to his work. The mockery lasted through the autumn. Children called it the glass icicle. The men at the grain elevator took bets on which day in December the first pane would shatter from the cold. They called it Vercelli's Folly, a monument to an immigrant's profound misunderstanding of the Dakota frontier. What did this Italian bell tower Glazier, a man from the sun-drenched foothills of the Piedmont, understand about solar physics and the bitter cold that men born to the prairie had missed entirely? This is a story of ingenuity born from desperation, of quiet knowledge pitted against loud opinion. It's a story about how one family survived one of the harshest winters on record, not with more fuel or a bigger stove, but with a strange glass tower that seemed to drink the weak winter sunlight and turn it into heat. I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand the elegant physics of a solar chimney, and you might just look at the winter sun in a whole new way. If you enjoy stories of frontier resilience and practical genius, consider subscribing to this channel, and let me know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution you've ever seen for a serious problem? Emilio Vercelli was not a farmer. He was not a carpenter, not a rancher, not a plainsman. His hands, now calloused from the rough pine and the heavy hammer, were shaped by a different trade, a different world. He was a glazier, a specialist from the Aosta Valley in the Italian Piedmont, a man whose life had been spent on high scaffolds, fitting lead and glass into the towering campaniles, the ancient bell towers that pierced the sky above his home. He understood the properties of glass, not as a simple window, but as a skin. He knew the secrets of stone, of heat, of air. His vocabulary was one of kilns and crucibles, of lead cames and ceramic tiles, of how a south-facing wall in the Alps could, with the right design, become a furnace powered by nothing but the sun. He had come to America with his wife Sophia and their 2 small children, Leo and Katerina, drawn by the promise of land, of a place to build a life from the soil up. But the Dakota Prairie was not the terraced, sun-warmed slope of a Piedmontese valley. Their first winter in 1907 was a brutal education. It was a cold that was not merely an absence of heat, but an active, malevolent force. Emilio watched his neighbor, a stout man named Bjornson, Discover his new windmill pump, his pride and joy. Useless on the first truly cold morning, its main iron pitman arm snapped clean in two by the contraction of the frozen metal. At the one-room schoolhouse, the teacher's ink, left on a shelf near the wall, had frozen solid in its well, and when he tried to chip it free, the slate itself cracked with a sharp report that echoed in the frigid air. Most chillingly, Emilio had seen a heavy wool overcoat left hanging on a wooden peg in the unheated church vestibule during a long Sunday service, crack like a sheet of ice at the shoulder when its owner tried to put it on. The frozen fibers simply gave way. Inside their own small cabin, that first winter was a siege. They had a good stove, but it was a hungry beast, devouring the cottonwood they had spent all autumn cutting and splitting. The heat it produced was a liar. It was a scorching 10-foot circle of warmth in a room that was otherwise freezing. Ice formed thick on the inside of the window panes, then crept like a living frost across the walls. At night, they would huddle together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the dark. Sophia would weep silently, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The children were always sick, their coughs a constant rasping soundtrack to the endless winter. Leo had a persistent wheeze, and little Katerina's skin was perpetually chapped and sore. Emilio felt a kind of despair he had never known, a cold that reached deeper than his bones, a cold that threatened to extinguish not just their lives, but their hope. He was a builder, a man who worked with his hands, and he could not keep his family warm. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the house. The problem was the physics of their failure. The conventional wisdom of the prairie was to build tight and burn hot. The cabins of Emilio's neighbors, like Lars Rasmussen's, were monuments to this philosophy. They were built of thick cottonwood logs, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud, straw, and lime. The roofs were sod, layers of prairie earth that offered mass but little true insulation. Inside the centerpiece of every home was the cast-iron stove, a black-bellied god demanding constant tribute. A family's wealth and foresight were measured by the size of its woodpile. But Emilio, having shivered through one Dakota winter, saw the flaw in the logic. He watched the smoke pour from his neighbors' chimneys and saw not warmth, but waste. He understood that the stove created a powerful convection cycle that was actively working against them. The superheated air from the stove rose directly to the ceiling, where it desperately sought a way out. It found it in the countless tiny gaps in the roof, around the single-pane windows, through the imperfectly sealed doorframe. This escaping hot air created a negative pressure inside the cabin, which in turn pulled frigid outside air at 10, 20, even 30 degrees below zero, through every crack and crevice at floor level. The result was a house perpetually at war with itself. The air near the ceiling could be a stifling 90 degrees, while a river of Arctic air flowed across the floor, freezing their feet and chilling the children as they slept. They were living in a thermal stratification nightmare, burning cords of wood simply to heat the top 6 inches of their home, before that heat was immediately lost to the outside. The frantic burning only accelerated the cycle, pulling more cold air in faster. It was a brute force solution that ignored the fundamental nature of heat and air. The prairie settlers were trying to overpower the cold, but Emilio knew you could not fight the physics of a Dakota winter. You had to persuade it. You had to use its own properties against it. The endless wood burning was a sign of failure, not of comfort. It was a constant, exhausting battle to fill a bucket that was riddled with holes using a thimble. So in the autumn of 1908, while his neighbors were stacking their wood piles ever higher, Emilio Vercelli began to build. He started with a foundation of fieldstone at the base of his cabin's south wall. From this, he erected the 20-foot-tall, 4-foot-square frame of pine. It was meticulous work. He was not a rough carpenter, he was a glazier, and he built with precision. The frame had to be perfectly plumb and square to accept the glass. The glass itself was his biggest investment. He'd used a significant portion of his savings to have the panes shipped from St. Paul. They were not large. Each was a standard 12 by 18-inch pane, the kind used for modest windows. He built the south face of the tower out of dozens of these, carefully overlapping them like shingles, each sealed with a tar and pine resin putty he mixed himself. The east and west sides of the tower were solid wood, insulated with packed straw. The back of the tower was the cabin wall itself. Inside this glass-fronted shaft, he installed wooden sheathing, which he then painted with a thick, sticky coat of black paint made from lamp black and linseed oil. At the very top of the tower, just below the roofline, he cut a rectangular opening into the cabin, a simple hole about 12 inches high and 24 inches wide. At the very bottom near the floor, he cut a second, identical opening. He fashioned simple wooden flaps for these vents, hinged with leather, so they could be opened or closed. The construction was a public spectacle. Wesley Chittenden made his official visit in late October. He walked around the structure, tapping the glass with a skeptical knuckle. He made notes in his ledger. Vercelli, he began, dropping the formal Mr. and adopting the tone of a man delivering a verdict. I am here on behalf of Sanborn County. My job is to assess the value of improvements on this land for the purposes of taxation. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. A standard farmhouse, a barn, a good well, these are expected improvements. This tower, he waved a dismissive hand at the structure, this is not a standard improvement. It serves no agricultural purpose. It is, in the county's view, an aesthetic extravagance, a form of over-improvement. Emilio stood silently, his hands stained with black paint. Sophia watched from the cabin doorway, her face tight with worry. Chittenden continued, flipping a page in his ledger. As such, I have no choice but to reclassify this parcel. The presence of such a unique and substantial non-agricultural structure changes its character. It will be assessed not as simple farmland, but at a commercial grade valuation. Your tax liability, payable next spring, will be approximately triple its current rate. He closed the book with a snap. I suggest you consider dismantling it before the final assessment in March. Good day. He turned and walked back to his buggy without another word. The threat was no longer social mockery, it was economic ruin. Triple the taxes would be impossible to pay. They would lose the farm. Emilio, Sophia said, her voice a strained whisper. What will we do? Emilio looked at the black tower, gleaming in the pale afternoon sun. He looked at the worried face of his wife. He put a hand on the cool glass. We will be warm, he said. And then we will see. He returned to his work, sealing the last of the panes. He was not building an extravagance. He was building a machine, a simple, elegant machine to capture the sun. The physics of Emilio's tower were both ancient and, for the Dakota Prairie in 1908, revolutionary. What he had built was a thermo-siphon, a passive heat engine that runs on a simple principle: hot air rises. His knowledge came from the Aosta Valley, where for centuries masons had built solariums, stone and glass structures, into the south faces of buildings to capture the intense alpine sun and heat interior spaces. Emilio had simply adapted the principle, translating it from stone to timber, and from the Alps to the prairie. The science begins with the sun. Even on the coldest winter day, the sun bombards the earth with a tremendous amount of energy. In the clear, thin air of a North Dakota winter, this can amount to as much as 2,400 British thermal units, or BTUs, per square foot of south-facing surface over the course of a day. A BTU is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's a small unit, but they add up quickly. The genius of Emilio's design was its efficiency in capturing and concentrating this energy. The glass panes on the tower's face acted as a one-way gate. Sunlight, which is short-wave radiation, passes easily through glass. It strikes the black-painted surface inside the tower. The black surface is a near-perfect absorber of this solar energy. It doesn't reflect the light. It converts it into heat. The surface temperature of the black-painted boards could easily exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air outside was far below zero. This heat is then re-radiated from the black surface, but as long-wave infrared radiation. Glass is largely opaque to this form of radiation. It can't pass back out. The heat is trapped. This is the familiar greenhouse effect, but Emilio's design took it a crucial step further. The trapped heat warms the column of air inside the 20-foot-tall tower. As this air heats up, it expands, becomes less dense, and begins to rise, just like smoke in a chimney. This is the solar chimney effect. The 20-foot height of the tower was not an aesthetic choice. It was a critical engineering parameter. The taller the column of heated air, the stronger the upward pressure, a phenomenon known as the stack effect. At the top of the tower, the heated air, now perhaps 60 to 70 degrees warmer than the ambient air, found the open vent Emilio had cut into the cabin wall. It had nowhere else to go. It flowed into the cabin, pouring a gentle, steady stream of warm air across the ceiling. By noon on a sunny day, the air entering the cabin could be as warm as 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This process would stall if not for the second, lower vent. As the hot air flowed into the top of the cabin, it displaced the coldest, densest air inside the house, the air that was pooled on the floor. This heavy, cool air was drawn naturally into the lower vent at the base of the tower. There, it entered the bottom of the solar chimney, was heated by the black absorber, and began its own journey upward. This created a continuous, silent, self-regulating loop. A great, slow-moving river of air. Cool air was drawn from the floor, heated by the sun, delivered back to the ceiling, and then slowly settled as it cooled, only to be drawn back into the system again. The cabin itself became part of the machine. The process required no fuel, no moving parts, no noise. It was powered entirely by the temperature differential created by the winter sun. Emilio had calculated that on a clear day, his system would deliver the equivalent of around 14,000 BTUs per hour into the cabin during peak sunlight, roughly the output of a small stove delivered for free all afternoon. He hadn't built a Folly, he had built a passive furnace. The test came in January of 1909. After a week of gray skies and moderate cold, the weather changed. A vast ridge of high pressure, a polar vortex, descended from the Arctic, settling over the northern plains. The sky turned a brilliant, cloudless, and merciless blue. The temperature plummeted. For 2 weeks, it never rose above 20 degrees below zero, even at midday. At night, it touched 30. A brutal, relentless 15-mile-per-hour wind blew from the west, driving the wind chill into a realm of truly dangerous cold. It was a polar clear sky event, the kind of weather that breaks machinery and spirits. For Emilio's neighbors, it was a living nightmare. The Rasmussen family's woodpile, which had seemed immense in November, was disappearing at an alarming rate. They kept their stove glowing red-hot day and night, but the cabin remained miserably cold. The walls were covered in a thick layer of rime ice. Water froze in the bucket a few feet from the stove. They lived in a small, huddled circle of blankets, moving as little as possible. Their world shrunk to the immediate vicinity of the cast iron. The children cried from the cold in their sleep. Lars felt a rising panic. At this rate, their wood would not last the winter, let alone this cold snap. At the Chittenden house in the small town of Sanborn, the land assessor himself was feeling the bite. Even in his well-built town home, the windows were opaque with frost. He burned expensive anthracite coal in his furnace, but the floors were ice cold, and drafts seemed to knife in from every direction. He thought more than once, with a grim and certain satisfaction, of the Italian out on the prairie with his ridiculous glass tower. By now, it must be a tomb of shattered glass and frozen hope. He imagined Vercelli and his family, huddled and freezing, regretting their foolishness. The thought offered a small bit of warmth. But in the Vercelli cabin, a different reality was unfolding. Each morning, as the sun cleared the horizon, Emilio would open the 2 wooden vents. At first, nothing happened. But as the sun climbed higher, a miracle began. A gentle, silent warmth would begin to pour from the upper vent. It wasn't a blast of hot air, but a steady, persistent flow. By 10 a.m., the chill was off the room. By noon, the cabin was filled with a comfortable, even heat. The contrast with their first winter was staggering. Sophia was able to do her mending without her fingers going numb. The children, Leo and Katerina, could play on the floor, not in heavy coats, but in their sweaters. There was no river of cold air at their feet. The terrible stratification was gone. The solar chimney was not just adding heat, it was actively circulating the air in the cabin, breaking up the cold pools and distributing the warmth evenly. The ice on the inside of the windows melted, leaving clear panes through which they could see the sun glinting on the brilliant frozen landscape. They still used their stove in the evenings and on cloudy days, but their wood consumption was a fraction of their neighbors. The tower was working. It was working better than Emilio had even dared to hope. The domestic warmth was proven by a small, specific detail. For Carnevale, the festival before Lent, Sophia had made a batch of bagna cauda, a traditional warm dip from Piedmont made with garlic, anchovies, and olive oil, served with bread and vegetables. It was a taste of home in the frozen wasteland. She kept the terracotta crock of it on a high shelf near the ceiling, a place that in any other cabin would have been the hottest and most unpleasant spot. But in their cabin, the air from the tower's vent kept the shelf at a perfect, gentle warmth. The butter and oil in the dip stayed liquid and fragrant all afternoon, ready for dipping. It was a small, mundane fact, but it was proof. In a land where everything was freezing, where their neighbors' stovetop pots of water would turn to ice before the coals had fully cooled, their simple crock of bagna cauda stayed warm. It was the warmth of home, powered by the sun. On the 11th day of the cold snap, Wesley Chittenden bundled himself into his heaviest coat and set out in his horse-drawn sled to make his tax circuit. The cold was so profound it seemed to have a sound, a high, thin ringing in the air. The snow squeaked under the sled's runners. His own breath froze instantly on his mustache and scarf, encasing his face in a mask of ice. He was heading west of town, and his route took him past the Vercelli place. As he approached their section line, he was already composing the speech he would give them, a stern but perhaps not unkind lecture about reality and the consequences of ignoring it. Then it happened. As the sled crossed a frozen, rutted section of the road near Vercelli's gate, there was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot. The left side of the sled dropped violently, pitching Chittenden into a snowdrift. He cursed, scrambling to his feet. The cold was too intense for the steel. The left runner had snapped clean through. He was stranded a good 2 miles from the nearest neighbor to the west, and a mile back to Vercelli's. His horse stood shivering, its coat already dusted with frost. Walking in this wind, in this temperature, was a dangerous proposition. He had no choice. Swallowing his pride, he unhitched the horse and began leading it toward the strange cabin with the glass tower. As he drew closer, he could see the sun, low but brilliant in the southern sky. Reflecting off the glass panes, he expected to see a scene of ruin, shattered glass, a family huddled in misery. Instead, the cabin looked quiet, peaceful. There wasn't even a plume of smoke from the chimney. Were they even alive? He tethered the horse to a post, and seeking a momentary respite from the relentless west wind, stumbled around to the south side of the cabin, into the lee of the glass tower. The moment he stepped into its shelter, the wind died. The sudden stillness was a blessing, and then he felt something else. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth on his face. He looked up. The sun was beating down on the glass. He leaned against the tower to catch his breath, his thickly mittened hand resting on one of the glass panes. He expected to feel a biting, instantaneous cold, the kind of cold that steals heat from your very bones. He expected the glass to feel like a block of ice. Instead, through his thick leather and wool mitten, he felt a distinct, unmistakable sensation. Heat. Not a lot, but it was undeniably there. A deep, resonant warmth radiating from within the glass structure. He pulled off his mitten, his bare fingers instantly aching in the 22-degree air. He pressed his palm flat against the glass. It was warm. Not hot, but profoundly, miraculously warm, like a sun-warmed stone on a summer day. He stood there for a long moment, utterly baffled. His entire understanding of the world, of heat and cold and winter, was being challenged by the palm of his hand. This glass contraption, this folly, was not a lens for the cold. It was a trap for the sun. He walked to the cabin door and knocked. When Emilio opened it, Chittenden was not blasted by the expected smell of wood smoke and stale, overheated air. He was met by a wave of nothing. Just quiet even. Fresh-feeling warmth. He stepped inside. The air was comfortable. His face, which had been numb, began to tingle back to life. He saw the children playing on the wooden floor. He saw Sophia at a table sewing, her hands bare. He looked at the stove. It was cold, its door shut, no fire within. Your stove is out," Chittenden stammered, his mind struggling to process the information. Emilio simply nodded toward the upper vent in the wall, where a piece of light yarn, tied to a nail, was fluttering gently in a steady, invisible current. "The sun is warm," he repeated, the same simple phrase he had used in the autumn. Chittenden walked over to the wall and held his hand under the vent. He felt it, a gentle, steady flow of genuinely warm air. He looked from the vent to the cold stove, to the children on the floor, to the clear, unfrosted window. He saw the terracotta crock on the high shelf. He looked at Emilio, and for the first time he saw not a foolish immigrant, but a man who possessed a kind of genius he couldn't begin to comprehend. The mockery drained out of him, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. "Vercelli," he said, his voice quiet, "you didn't build a wall. You built a waterfall of heat." He finally understood. The mockery of the autumn was a distant, foolish memory. The validation was here, in this quiet, warm room. Wesley Chittenden became Emilio Vercelli's most unlikely and powerful advocate. He spent the rest of the afternoon at the cabin, not as an assessor, but as a student. Emilio, with Sophia and Leo, translating his more complex Piedmontese terms, explained the principle. He drew diagrams in the frost on the window pane, showing the loop of air, the trapped heat, the stack effect. Chittenden, a man of ledgers and laws, listened with the rapt attention of a convert. He helped Emilio mend the sled runner, and when he left at dusk, he shook the glazier's hand with a new and deep respect. The first thing he did upon returning to Sanborn was to march into the county office and tear up his reassessment notice. He refiled the original assessment, adding a personal note in the margin. Improvement is a standard, highly efficient heating apparatus. No-cost fuel. Genius in design. The story of the Vercelli cabin spread through the frozen prairie like a slow thaw. It traveled first by word of mouth, carried by Chittenden himself on his rounds. When he told it, His voice held a note of reverence. The tale of the warm glass and the cold stove was repeated at the general store, at the grain elevator, at church gatherings. It was met with disbelief, then curiosity. Lars Rasmussen, having heard the story from 3 different sources, finally hitched his wagon and made the trip himself on a sunny day. He stood in Vercelli's cabin, felt the warm air from the vent, and simply shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. The true vehicle for the idea's spread, however, came from further afield. Emilio, at Sophia's urging, wrote a long letter to his cousin in Chicago. In it, he described the Dakota winter and the tower he had built to defeat it. He included detailed sketches, with dimensions and instructions, written in his careful Italian script. The cousin, a proud and well-connected man, saw the importance of the innovation. He took the letter not to a builder, but to the editor of L'Italia, a prominent Italian-language newspaper serving the immigrant communities of the Midwest. In March of 1909, L'Italia published a full-page article under the headline Un campanile solare sconfigge il freddo del Dakota. A sun tower defeats the Dakota cold. The article featured Emilio's story and his redrawn, professional-looking plans. It celebrated him as an example of Italian ingenuity thriving in the harsh new world. The paper circulated widely among the tight-knit communities of northern Italian immigrants who had settled on the plains. For them, Emilio was not a strange outsider, but one of their own. They trusted the source. By the autumn of 1909, 4 other Piedmontese farmsteads, 2 in Sanborn County and 2 in neighboring Beadle County, had erected their own glass towers, each a proud, dark finger pointing at the southern sky. The idea was spreading. The simple glass tower on a Dakota Prairie cabin was more than just a clever trick. It was a precursor, an intuitive leap into the science of passive solar design that was decades ahead of its time. Emilio Vercelli, with his glazier's knowledge of glass and his alpine understanding of the sun, had built a device that modern architects would recognize as a trombe wall or a solar chimney. These systems, now engineered with high-tech materials and computer modeling, all operate on the same fundamental thermosiphon principle that Emilio sketched out by hand. He anticipated a cornerstone of sustainable, energy-efficient building by nearly a century, not through formal education, but through observation, memory, and necessity. His tower stands as a testament to the fact that the most advanced ideas are often elegant rediscoveries of the Simtfinkiel for simple, powerful truths about the natural world. In the end, the story of Vercelli's Folly is about a profound shift in perspective. The other settlers saw the Dakota winter as an enemy to be fought, an opponent to be overpowered with roaring fires and thick walls. They were locked in a brute force battle, burning their resources in a desperate attempt to hold the cold at bay. Emilio Vercelli saw it differently. He did not try to fight the winter. He looked at the essential elements of his predicament: the bitter cold, the relentless wind, and the brilliant, low-hanging sun. And he saw not just problems, but ingredients. He understood that the sun, even in the depths of winter, was not his enemy's absence, but his most powerful, untapped ally. He didn't heat his cabin with a bigger stove or a larger woodpile. He simply, elegantly, asked the winter sun to climb a glass chimney and pour its warmth back down through his ceiling. He built a ladder for the light. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. We believe the past has valuable lessons for the future, and stories like Emilio Vercelli's deserve to be remembered. If you found this story inspiring or informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of practical genius. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and modern building science. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.